Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you here in Rome. Welcome to Rome. What we're going to do this morning then is present the encyclical of Pope Francis and basically focusing on those sections that relate to urban development and urban planning. So, with further ado, Pope Francis' 2015 encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home calls urban planners to an ecological conversion. So that's why I'm here on the pulpit, to ask you for conversion. And this ecological conversion regards the integration of city design with the natural environment and also with people's quality of life. And of course, since we are under the papacy of Pope Francis, with a special concern for the poor and the excluded in our cities. So this presentation this morning reflects on the relationship between urban development, environmental ecology, and human ecology, as presented in Pope Francis' second encyclical, Laudato Si. I first present the general ecological message of the Holy Father's encyclical and focus then on the integration in city design of the natural environment that is attentive to the true human flourishing, as well as his or her call for better housing, especially for the poor. And I conclude with suggestions for caring for our common home in city planning and city design. Laudato Si is Pope Francis' urgent call to humanity in general to become aware of the negative and immoral impact it has on the planet. It calls its common home environmental ecological crisis, as well as the destructive behavior of humans that they perpetuate against their fellow human beings, what Pope Francis and the encyclical calls the human ecological crisis. In analyzing the current environmental ecological crisis, the encyclical takes a wider perspective by not only addressing the negative impact that human beings have on the environment, but also tackles the many philosophies, religions, and theologies and cultural attitudes that menace in different situations the relationship between humanity and the natural world, in addition to the bonds with the human family. So here we see in 4 sections what are the main concerns of the encyclical. The philosophies, basically those which despise the body, the matter, and the things of this world, so they tend to be only spiritual. The cultural, which is the rampant individualism, and the many problems of society are connected with today's self-centered and instant gratification society. Also theological, those religions, including within our own Catholicism and Christianity, spiritualities that tend to have a dualistic vision that separate the body from the spirit. And then, of course, the human family, because ultimately for Pope Francis, it is the unity of the human family that is also important. And this environmental crisis affects the relationship between the human family. The environmental and human ecological challenge of the beginning of the third millennium, not to do preachy moral chastisement, but the Pope Francis calls to dialogue and to conversion. With regards to dialogue, Pope Francis says, and I quote, "I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a global conversation that includes everyone, since the environment challenge we are all undergoing, and its human roots concern and affects us all." End of quote. Moreover, this dialogue, which Pope Francis is calling, affects all those who share this planet Earth as their home. And he especially calls Christians to a profound interior moral conversion. He states, "The ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. It must be said that some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. Others are passive. They choose not to change their habits and thus become inconsistent. So what they all need is an ecological conversion, whereby the effects of their encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. Living our vocation as Christians to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an option or a secondary aspect of our Christian experience. So in this encyclical, Pope Francis truly unites the ecological gospel with the gospel of salvation and redemption, and is the first encyclical to truly unite these things together. As Sylvia Goulard, President of the European Parliament's Intergroup on Extreme Poverty, concludes, and I quote, "The Pope's call reaches out to all responsible people, whether or not they are believers. Following the spirit of the gospel, the Pope is speaking to all people of goodwill by calling for a universal initiative which would reach across national borders and give topmost priority to the preservation of our common home." End of quote. So now we move to the second topic, which is how do we integrate the natural world into city design, which is the main focus of this conference. Laudato Si explains that many cities have truly become unlivable. They are unlivable places for human beings, due not only to air, audio, and visual pollution, inadequate transportation, traffic gridlocks, segregation, inequality, and violence, but also because there is a marked loss of identity, a silent rupture of the bonds of integration and social cohesion. So not only do we see physical destruction, but we also see a destruction of the bonds that unite humanity. There's a disconnect between our own human lives and that of the places we live in. As Pope Francis writes, nowadays, for example, we are conscious of the disproportionate and unruly growth of many cities, which have become unhealthy to live in, not only because of pollution caused by toxic emissions, but also as a result of urban chaos, poor transportation, and visual pollution and noise. Many cities are huge, inefficient structures, excessively wasteful of energy and of water. Neighborhoods, even those recently built, are congested, chaotic, and lacking in sufficient green space. We were not meant to be inundated by cement, asphalt, glass, and metal, and deprived of physical contact with nature itself." End of quote. The Holy Father proposes to those who design buildings, neighborhoods, public spaces, and cities that urban development needs to take into account in their city planning the interconnectedness of the natural and living environments, because the dwelling environment humans create has a direct impact on how humans thrive and behave in society. Therefore, city planners, and I quote, ought to draw on the various disciplines which help us to understand people's thought processes, symbolic language, and ways of acting. It is not enough to seek the beauty of design. End of quote. Urban development must truly serve the exterior and the interior needs of city dwellers by taking into consideration the view of those who will live in these cities. In other words, to create in dialogue with city dwellers better cities that contribute to physical contact and encounter and places of mutual assistance. The Pope also highlights in his encyclical the importance of preserving common areas, visual landmarks, and urban landscapes that give a city a special character and familiarity. These fundamental city elements, like monuments, increase the sense of belonging, of rootedness, of feeling at home within a city which includes us and brings us together. and that are so important for human flourishing. As Next City journalist Ann Clark states in her article on building better cities, and I quote, "Preservation of structures and spaces for their own sake is irrelevant." Here she's speaking of monuments and historical buildings. Rather, preservation efforts should be tailored to the public good and should be accessible to all. When they are well integrated into the landscape, residents of the city will feel a deepened sense of the whole. When they are not well integrated, they contribute to division and separation, isolation and separateness. So she's stating basically as encyclical that monuments and historical buildings, special landmarks, make cities familiar, therefore feel more at home, which also contributes to human flourishing and integration. This ecological encyclical also addresses the transportation crisis in our modern cities. The prevalence of a worldwide car culture is the cause of traffic congestion, raising the level of pollution, and consuming enormous quantities of non-renewable energy. This leads many nations to build more highways and parking spaces, which spoil the urban landscape. But changing transportation policies and directing all to public transportation will not prove easily acceptable to a comfortable driving society. And the Pope states, and I quote, "Unless substantial improvements are made in the systems themselves, which in many cities force people to put up with undignified conditions due to crowding, inconvenience, infrequent service, and lack of safety." End of quote. To conclude this section on integrating human ecology, environmental ecology, and city planning, Pope Francis does not want to leave out the preservation of untouched natural spaces. He states, and I quote, "Interventions which affect the urban or rural landscape should take into account how various elements combine to form a whole which is perceived by its inhabitants as a coherent and meaningful framework for their lives. Others will then no longer be seen as strangers, but as part of a we, which all of us are working to create. For this same reason, in both urban and rural settings, it is helpful to set aside some places which can be preserved and protected from constant changes brought by human intervention." End of quote. The problem of human housing is also addressed by Laudato Si, as well as the moral obligation city planners have not to exclude the poor from urban development. Better housing, especially for the poor. Shelter is a basic human need in addition to a fundamental natural right. Nonetheless, even wealthy nations grapple with the ever-growing housing problems of its citizens, especially of their poor and immigrants. This housing problem has become a world crisis by the ever-increasing population of cities due to migration from rural areas to the cities, as well as from foreign nationals who in general settle in hosting cities in search of work and a more promising future. These factors are causing disastrous effects on urban shelter and basic services. As Indian sociologist Pooja Mondal warns, and I quote, "There is a severe housing shortage in urban areas with demand and supply gap increasing day by day. The Indian National Building Organization has estimated the 1991 urban housing shortage at 8.23 million and had expected the absolute shortage to decline progressively to 7.57 million in 1997 and 6.64 million in 2001. End of quote. Pope Francis highlights that government in general assign a small portion of the national budget for providing housing for all social classes, a fact that goes against the dignity of all citizens that he defends throughout his encyclical. And I quote, "Having a home has much to do with a sense of personal dignity and the growth of families." End of quote. The situation is always worse for those of the lower social classes. And I quote, "In some places where makeshift shanty towns have sprung up, this will mean developing those neighborhoods rather than raising or displacing them. When the poor live in unsanitary slums or in dangerous tenements, in cases where it is necessary to relocate them in order not to heap suffering upon suffering, adequate information needs to be given beforehand, with choices of decent housing offered, and the people directly involved must be part of the process." End of quote. The deterioration of the natural environment and of society especially has negative consequences on the poor of the world. And I quote, "The impact of present imbalances is also seen in the premature death of many of the poor, in conflicts sparked by the shortage of resources, and in any number of other problems which are insufficiently represented in global agendas." End of quote. This situation is aggravated by the privatization of certain spaces of beauty, as well as communities close to outsiders in order to ensure an artificial tranquility, the so-called gated communities, especially for the disposable of society. Moreover, as Pope Francis laments, and I quote, "It needs to be said that, generally speaking, there's little in the way of clear awareness of problems which especially affect the excluded." End of quote. Furthermore, a true green approach must always take into consideration a social approach. And I quote, "That means it must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor." End of quote. Planners must also consider that the poorest areas and countries are less capable of adopting new models for reducing environmental impact because they lack the wherewithal to develop the necessary processes and to cover their cost. End of quote. Laudato Si likewise warns on finding an easy solution in population control for the problem of the environment. Housing and the poor, says the Pope, to blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism on the part of some is one way of refusing to face the issues. It is an attempt to legitimize the present model of distribution, where a minority believes that it has the right to consume in a way which can never be universalized, since the planet could not even contain the waste products of such consumption. End of quote. To conclude this final section, every ecological housing solution must, and I quote, "incorporate a social perspective which takes into account the fundamental rights of the poor and the underprivileged." End of quote. As Pope Francis exhorts, and I quote, "Creativity should be shown in integrating rundown neighborhoods into a welcoming city. How beautiful those cities which overcome paralyzing mistrust, integrate those who are different, and make this very integration a new factor of development. How attractive are those cities which, even in their architectural design, are full of spaces which connect, relate, and favor the recognition of others." End of quote. Conclusion. Pope Francis' ecological encyclical Laudato Si insists on the moral cause for city development and design. Whether he's arguing for the creation of cities that are truly places of physical contact and encounter and mutual assistance, preserving common areas, visual landmarks, and urban landscapes that give cities their special character, familiarity, and make them home for the citizens of the world, all within a context of dialogue between city planners, government, and city dwellers. He always calls all to integrate environmental ecology and city planning with human ecology. And I quote, "Our insistence that each human being is an image of God should not make us overlook the fact that each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. This is especially true of the poor and the thrown away from society." This holistic, sustainable ecological call must include a true ecological conversion and not just an ecological awareness. And I quote, "People may well have a growing ecological sensitivity, but it has not succeeded in changing their harmful habits of consumption, which, rather than decreasing, appear to be growing all the more." End of quote. This is made more corrosive by the imposition of a dominant lifestyle linked to a single form of production that can be just as harmful as the altering of the ecosystems. End of quote. Our habitats are intensely personal and influence how we think, how we feel, how we act, and express our own personal identity. And I quote, "Authentic development includes efforts to bring about an integral improvement in the quality of human life. And this entails considering the setting in which people live their lives. These settings influence the way we think, feel, and act in our rooms, our homes, our workplaces, and neighborhoods. We use our environment as a way of expressing our identity. We make every effort to adapt to our environment, but when it is disorderly, chaotic, and saturated with noise and ugliness, such overstimulation makes it difficult to find ourselves integrated and happy." End of quote. If our living spaces are well-designed, equitable, serviceable, historic, coherent, and integrated with the natural world, they, according to Pope Francis, make it possible to recover something of our true selves. Thank you very much.